Life has a way of turning to dust in your hands just when you think you've built something permanent. That phone call still echoes in my mind, haunting me during quiet moments when I let my guard down. My son Rick's voice had an edge I'd never heard before. "Mom, pack your bags. I'm taking you where you deserve." Those words sliced through me like winter wind through a worn coat. At 72, after dedicating my entire life to being a good mother, a dedicated teacher, and an honest human being, I never imagined such simple words could conceal such calculated betrayal. I'm Martha Wilson, and my story isn't one I ever thought I'd share publicly. For 40 years, I taught third grade at Burlington Elementary, waking before sunrise, grading papers late into the night, returning home with chalk dust in my hair and hope in my heart. When my husband James died in Vietnam, leaving me alone with our 3-year-old son, I promised myself Rick would never feel the absence of love in his life. I worked 2 jobs some summers, saved every penny I could, attended every baseball game and school play. My hands, the same hands that now tremble slightly as I speak, built a life for us brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice. That Thursday morning in April, as I folded my cardigans and packed my medications, I kept glancing at the photographs lining my hallway, yellowed images capturing moments that felt like they belonged to someone else's life now. Rick at 7, grinning with a missing front tooth and a fishing rod taller than himself. Rick at 16, proudly holding his driver's license. Rick and Valerie on their wedding day, looking like they'd stepped out of a magazine. The same boy who now, at 45, had something cold and unrecognizable behind his eyes when he looked at me. I remember packing my favorite teacup, wrapped carefully in one of James's old handkerchiefs that I still kept in my dresser drawer. Such a small thing to bring, but it had been a gift from my students when I retired. "World's best teacher," it said in faded gold letters. I wondered if I'd ever use it again wherever Rick was taking me. The thought crossed my mind that perhaps he and Valerie had prepared a surprise, perhaps a guest house on their property, where I could be close to them and my granddaughter Emma. How desperately I clung to that hope, even as something inside me whispered warnings I refused to hear. When Rick arrived that afternoon, his expensive car gleaming in my modest driveway, he barely looked at me. There was no hug, no warm smile, just a perfunctory nod as he took my suitcase and tossed it in the trunk as if it contained nothing of value. I noticed Valerie wasn't with him, which struck me as odd. "Where's Valerie?" I asked, settling into the passenger seat of his car that smelled of new leather and the artificial pine scent from the air freshener. "She's taking care of some things," was his vague reply, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "She'll meet us later." I should have recognized then that something was deeply wrong, but hope is stubborn when it comes to the children we've raised. We want to believe in their goodness, even when evidence points elsewhere. It's like continuing to water a plant long after it's died, refusing to accept that no amount of care will bring it back to life. The drive was mostly silent. I tried several times to make conversation, commenting on the beautiful spring blossoms, asking about Emma's college applications, mentioning the new bakery downtown that I thought he might like to try. Each attempt was met with monosyllabic responses or a tight smile that never reached his eyes. His knuckles were white from gripping the steering wheel too hard, and occasionally I caught him glancing at me with what looked almost like guilt. "Rick," I finally said, placing my hand gently on his arm. "Is everything all right, son?" He flinched slightly at my touch. "Everything's fine, Mom. We're almost there." The "there" he referred to became clear as we turned onto a tree-lined drive I didn't recognize. The neighborhoods had grown increasingly unfamiliar as we drove, moving away from the heart of Burlington where I'd spent my entire adult life. We were heading towards the outskirts of town, where the houses grew farther apart and the landscape more rural. Finally, we pulled up to a large gate, painted a faded blue. A discreet sign, weathered by years of Vermont winters, announced, "Pine Haven Assisted Living Facility." The words hit me like a physical blow. I turned to Rick, searching his face for some indication that this was a mistake, some sign that we were just dropping something off for someone else, anything except the cruel reality that was beginning to crystallize. "Rick," I whispered, my voice sounding foreign even to myself, "this is a nursing home. He turned off the engine but kept staring straight ahead, unable or unwilling to meet my eyes. The silence stretched between us like a chasm growing wider by the second. "It's an assisted living facility, Mom," he finally said, as if the distinction somehow softened what was happening. It's not what you think." "What I think," I said carefully, fighting to keep my voice steady, "is that you've brought me to a place for elderly people who need care. But I don't need care, Rick. I live independently. I still drive. I volunteer at the library 3 days a week. I bake cookies for Emma whenever she visits from college." Each example felt like evidence I was presenting in my own defense, proof of my competence that shouldn't have been necessary to provide to my own son. He sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair, a gesture so reminiscent of his father that for a moment my heart ached with a different kind of pain. "Mom, it's the best for everyone. We don't have space at our house anymore with Emma coming home for the summer, and you'll need care that we can't provide." Care? The word hung in the air between us. I still cooked every meal from scratch, managed my Victorian home with its creaky stairs and temperamental plumbing, tended my garden that was the envy of the neighborhood, took my morning walks along Lake Champlain in all but the most brutal winter weather. What care could he possibly be referring to? As Rick spoke, the truth revealed itself in what remained unsaid. This wasn't about care. It was about convenience. My presence, my very existence, had become inconvenient for the life Valerie wanted. Perhaps for the image they were trying to project in their new neighborhood with their new friends. Perhaps for the financial freedom they would gain from my house, which I had foolishly signed over to Rick 6 months earlier when he claimed it would simplify things for tax purposes. "You can't do this to me," I said, feeling tears forming at the corners of my eyes. "That house is mine. I built it with the sweat of my work, with every extra dollar I saved while raising you alone. The house is in my name now, Mom. You signed the papers, remember? They were to make banking matters easier." And then, like lightning, I remembered that stack of documents I signed months ago, when Rick said it was just a formality to help me with accounts. I had transferred my own house, the house where I'd raised him, the house that held every memory of our life together, to his name, without understanding the consequences of that act of trust. The blue gate opened. A woman in a white coat approached with a practiced smile. Evelyn, I would later learn, was the social worker at Pinehaven. While she talked about visiting hours and adaptation procedures, I observed through the facility's windows aged faces watching me with curiosity. Some waved timidly, others simply observed with eyes that had seen too much abandonment. Rick took my suitcase from the trunk and placed it on the ground. He made a motion as if to hug me but then retreated. Perhaps the weight of guilt was too heavy even for a goodbye embrace. "I'll come visit on Sunday," he promised, avoiding my eyes. And then, as abruptly as he had entered my life 45 years before, my son left, leaving behind not just his mother but any trace of the boy I once knew. That first night at Pinehaven, lying in a strange bed with sheets that smelled of industrial detergent, I cried silently, not for the walls of my house, nor for the possessions left behind. I cried for the invisible thread that had broken between me and my son. I cried for the betrayal that came from the hands I myself had taught to write, from the heart I had nurtured with so much love. But something inside me, that strength that had always moved me forward, through James's death, through the challenges of single motherhood, through decades of shaping young minds in my classroom, refused to accept this as the final chapter of my story. As I dried my tears, a resolution was born in my heart. I would not be just another elderly person abandoned and forgotten. I would not accept that my life, built with such effort and love, would end between these unfamiliar walls. You know how it feels when the world seems to collapse around you? Have you ever experienced a betrayal so deep it seems impossible to breathe? That's how I felt during those first days at Pinehaven. But what I didn't know was that there, among those people who seemed as fragile as I felt, I would find powerful allies for what was to come. Are you still with me? Where are you watching from? Have you ever witnessed something like this happening to someone close to you? Or maybe you're going through something similar right now. Stay with me until the end, because what happened after this abandonment changed not just my life, but the lives of everyone around me. including my own son. If you haven't subscribed to the Revenge Expected channel yet, do it now. This story is just beginning, and what comes next will show you that even in our darkest moments, there's always a light guiding us forward. It was on the third day of my stay at Pinehaven that I received a knock on my door that would change everything. But before I get to that, let me tell you about those first 72 hours, the darkest hours of my life. After Rick drove away, leaving me standing at the entrance of Pinehaven with nothing but a suitcase and shattered trust, Evelyn Sharp guided me through sterile hallways to what she cheerfully called my new home. Room 217, a rectangle with mint green walls, a narrow bed, a small bathroom, and a window overlooking a parking lot. No character, no warmth, no history. Nothing like the home I'd spent 4 decades creating. Dinner is at 5:30, Evelyn explained, her practiced smile never reaching her eyes. Breakfast at 7:30, lunch at noon. There's bingo on Tuesdays, crafts on Thursdays, and a visiting pastor on Sundays. Dr. Miller checks in on residents every other Monday. She spoke as if reciting from a script she'd delivered hundreds of times, barely looking at me, more focused on the clipboard in her hands than the human being whose life had just been upended. I wondered if she'd seen this scenario play out so often that she'd become numb to it. Children abandoning parents like unwanted furniture, with practiced excuses and hollow promises to visit. The call button is here if you need assistance, she continued, pointing to a red button on the wall. Lights out at Tengi, but you can read with your bedside lamp if you'd like. Lights out? I hadn't had a bedtime since I was a child myself. The indignity of it burned in my throat, but I couldn't find words to protest. I was still in shock, still processing the betrayal that had brought me here. "Do you have any questions, Mrs. Wilson?" Evelyn asked, finally meeting my eyes. 1,000 questions swirled in my mind. How could my son do this to me? What legal rights did I have? Could I leave? Did anyone know I was here? Instead, I asked the only question my numb mind could formulate. When can I go home? Evelyn's expression shifted slightly. Was it pity? Discomfort? "This is your home now, Mrs. Wilson. Your son explained that your house has been sold." Sold? My Victorian home on Maple Street, with its wraparound porch where I'd spent countless summer evenings grading papers, its garden where I'd taught Rick to plant sunflower seeds, its kitchen where I'd baked birthday cakes for every year of his life, the house that still held James's records in the living room cabinet, his medals in a box in my closet, the mark on the kitchen doorframe where we'd measured Rick's height every birthday. Sold, without my knowledge or consent. I sat heavily on the edge of the bed, my legs suddenly unable to support me. Evelyn, perhaps sensing my distress, muttered something about giving me time to settle in, and retreated, closing the door behind her with a soft click that somehow sounded as final as a prison cell locking. That first night was the longest of my life. I didn't unpack my suitcase. Some stubborn part of me refused to acknowledge this place as anything but temporary. I lay fully clothed on top of the stiff bedspread, watching shadows move across the ceiling as cars passed outside, their headlights briefly illuminating my prison. Sleep evaded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Rick's face as he drove away. The guilty sidelong glance, the set of his jaw, the deliberate way he avoided eye contact. I saw Valerie's influence in his actions, remembered her subtle comments over the years. "Your house is so big for just one person, Martha, and wouldn't it be easier for everyone if you were somewhere with people to look after you?" I dismissed these remarks as thoughtless rather than calculated. Now I wondered how long they'd been planning this. Morning came with the jarring sound of an intercom announcement calling residents to breakfast. I ignored it, remaining curled on my side facing the wall. A nurse I hadn't met came to check on me, insisting I needed to eat, but I sent her away. Food was the furthest thing from my mind. The day passed in a haze. I moved between the bed and the single armchair by the window, watching people come and go in the parking lot below. Families visiting elderly relatives, bringing flowers, holding hands as they walked inside. Would Rick really come on Sunday as he'd promised? And if he did, what would I say to him? The anger that had begun to replace my shock was so intense, I wasn't sure I could trust myself to speak to him without saying things that couldn't be unsaid. By evening, Hunger finally drove me from my room. I followed the sound of clattering dishes to a large dining hall filled with round tables. Most were occupied by groups of residents chatting over their meals, but a few people sat alone, staring vacantly at plates of unappetizing food. I joined their ranks, taking a seat at an empty table in the corner. A server brought me a tray containing something that resembled meatloaf, mashed potatoes from a box, and overcooked green beans. I pushed the food around my plate, taking a few mechanical bites without tasting anything. The conversation around me, discussions of medications, complaints about the weather, debates about television shows I'd never watched, seemed to be happening in another dimension. "First night's always the hardest," said a voice, breaking through my isolation. I looked up to see an elderly man with a neatly trimmed white beard settling into the chair across from me, his own tray balanced carefully in gnarled hands. "Walter Jenkins," he said, offering me a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Been here 2 years. Food doesn't improve, but you'll get used to it." I didn't want to get used to it. I didn't want to accept this as my new reality. But something about Walter's matter-of-fact kindness pierced the protective shell I'd built around myself. "Martha Wilson," I replied, my voice hoarse from disuse. "My son brought me yesterday." Walter nodded, understanding immediately what I wasn't saying. "My daughter did the same. Told me it was just for a few weeks while they renovated the guest room for me. That was 2 Christmases ago." The familiar story sparked a flicker of connection. For the first time since arriving at Pinehaven, I felt slightly less alone. "Does it get easier?" I asked, hating how fragile my voice sounded. Walter considered this, taking a bite of meatloaf before answering. "Not easier, different. You learn to build a life in the spaces between their broken promises." We ate in companionable silence after that, and when I returned to my room that night, I finally unpacked my suitcase, not in acceptance, but in recognition that whatever happened next might take time. The second day followed a similar pattern. I avoided the organized activities, the forced socialization, the well-meaning but patronizing staff who addressed me as if I were a child. I spent hours staring at the phone on my bedside table, willing it to ring, for Rick to call and say it had all been a terrible mistake. It remained stubbornly silent. That evening, I ventured to the small library off the main common room, hoping to find something to occupy my restless mind. The selection was limited, mostly romance novels with tattered covers and outdated encyclopedias, but I discovered a dog-eared copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, my favorite book to teach to my 8th graders before I'd moved to 3rd grade. I took it back to my room, finding a small comfort in Atticus Finch's wisdom and integrity, qualities my own son seemed to have abandoned. On the 3rd morning, something shifted inside me. Perhaps it was anger crystallizing into resolve, or perhaps it was simply the survival instinct that had carried me through widowhood and single motherhood, asserting itself once again. Whatever the cause, I woke with a determination to understand my situation fully and to find a way out. I showered, dressed carefully in one of the few outfits I'd brought, and applied lipstick for the first time since arriving. If I was going to fight, I needed to armor myself with dignity. I made my way to the administration office, where a young receptionist looked surprised to see me. Most residents, I would later learn, avoided this part of the facility, intimidated by the paperwork and bureaucracy it represented. "I'd like to see my admission documents," I said firmly, channeling the voice I'd used with particularly unruly students, "and I'd like to use the phone to call a lawyer." The receptionist blinked, clearly unprepared for such direct requests. "I'll need to check with Director Sharp," she stammered, reaching for her phone. Before she could make the call, an elegant silver-haired woman appeared in the doorway of an adjacent office. She observed me with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. "You must be Martha Wilson," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Grace Hernandez. I believe we need to talk." There was an authority in her manner that made even the receptionist straighten in her chair. Without waiting for a response, Grace gestured for me to follow her down a hallway I hadn't explored before, to a small but comfortably furnished room that looked more like a home office than part of an institution. "Sit," she said, indicating an armchair by the window. "I've been waiting for you to emerge from your room." I sat, confused by this unexpected encounter. "Are you part of the administration?" Grace laughed, a rich sound that seemed out of place in the sterile environment of Pine Haven. Hardly. I'm a resident like you, but I'm also a retired civil rights attorney, and I've made it my business to help people like us navigate situations like yours. She poured tea from a ceramic pot on a side table, real tea, not the cheap tea bags served in the dining hall, and handed me a cup on a saucer with a blue willow pattern that reminded me of my grandmother's china. "Now," she said, settling across from me with her own cup, "tell me everything. How you ended up here, what documents you signed, what was said. Leave nothing out." For the next hour, I poured out my story to this stranger who somehow didn't feel strange at all. I told her about the lifetime spent building my home, about raising Rick alone, about the slow distancing that began after his marriage to Valerie. I described the documents I'd signed months ago, believing Rick's explanation that they were simply to help with banking matters as I aged. I detailed the phone call, the drive to Pine Haven, the shock of realizing what was happening. Grace listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes in a leather-bound notebook. When I finally fell silent, emotionally exhausted from reliving the betrayal, she set down her pen and looked me directly in the eyes. "Martha, what your son and daughter-in-law have done isn't just morally reprehensible, it's illegal. They've committed elder abuse and fraud. You were coerced into signing over your property without understanding what you were doing. That's textbook undue influence, and it's grounds for invalidating those transfers." Her words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples of hope through my despair. "You mean I could get my house back?" "It won't be simple or quick," Grace cautioned. "But yes, there are legal remedies. Vermont has strong elder protection laws, and what they've done violates several statutes." She explained that she had connections with legal aid services specializing in elder rights, and that her friend Thomas Reynolds, a retired attorney who still took pro bono cases, visited Pine Haven weekly to offer free legal consultation to residents. "He'll be here tomorrow," Grace said, refilling my teacup. "In the meantime, I suggest you request your complete file from administration. You have a right to see everything they have on you, including admission documents. Don't let them tell you otherwise." As Grace spoke, I felt something I hadn't experienced since arriving at Pine Haven. Hope, not just hope for reclaiming my home, but hope that I wasn't powerless, that there were paths forward besides passive acceptance. "Why are you helping me?" I asked, curious about this remarkable woman who seemed so out of place in an assisted living facility. Grace's expression softened. "Because 3 years ago, I was you. My son Robert got power of attorney when I broke my hip, then used it to drain my accounts and commit me here. Said it was for my safety. By the time I realized what had happened, he'd liquidated most of my assets." She gestured around the office. I fought back, with Thomas's help. Won my case, recovered what assets remained. Could have left Pine Haven, but I realized I could do more good here, helping others who've been discarded by the very people who should protect them. As she spoke, I noticed photographs on her desk, younger versions of Grace surrounded by children who must be grandchildren or great-grandchildren. Grace receiving awards, Grace protesting in what looked like civil rights demonstrations from decades past. "You could have gone anywhere after winning your case," I observed. "Why stay here?" Grace's smile contained both sadness and resolve. "Because my son hasn't changed, Martha. He's still the same person who betrayed me, but I've changed. I found a purpose greater than resentment. Every person I help here is a victory against the system that makes it too easy to throw away our elders." Her words planted a seed in my heart, but at that moment the pain of Rick's betrayal was still too raw for me to consider such perspective. I wanted justice. I wanted my house back. I wanted my son to understand the gravity of what he had done. "What's the first step?" I asked, setting down my teacup with newfound determination. "We document everything," Grace replied, her attorney's precision returning. "Every conversation you had with Rick and Valerie about your house, every document you signed, every promise made. Then we start building your case." As I left Grace's office that afternoon, I felt fundamentally changed from the woman who had entered Pine Haven 3 days earlier. The despair hadn't disappeared, but alongside it now burned a flame of purpose. I would not be a victim. I would fight for what was rightfully mine. I didn't know then how this battle would transform not just my circumstances, but my understanding of family, forgiveness, and my own capacity for resilience. I couldn't have imagined the allies I would find, the system I would help expose, or the lives that would be changed, including my own son's, by what had begun as an act of cruel betrayal. As I returned to my room to begin writing down every detail I could remember about the property transfer, my mind kept returning to something Grace had said. You learn to build a life in the spaces between their broken promises. I wasn't ready to accept Pine Haven as my permanent home, but I was ready to transform my pain into action. Little did I know that the very next day, I would receive a visitor who would change the course of my fight completely and reveal that Rick and Valerie's betrayal went far beyond what I could have imagined. The morning after my conversation with Grace, I woke with a sense of purpose that had been absent since my arrival at Pine Haven. I'd spent much of the night documenting every detail I could remember about the property transfer. Dates, conversations, who was present, what was said. My teacher's habit of thorough record-keeping served me well as I filled page after page of the small notebook Grace had given me. I was just finishing breakfast in the dining hall when Evelyn Sharp approached my table, her clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield. "Mrs. Wilson," she said with forced brightness, "you have a visitor waiting in the reception area." My heart leaped. Had Rick come early, before Sunday? Was he having second thoughts? I smoothed my hair, straightened my cardigan, and followed Evelyn through the maze of hallways, mentally rehearsing what I would say to my son. But it wasn't Rick waiting for me in the small visiting room with its faded floral wallpaper and uncomfortable chairs. Instead, a young woman with auburn hair pulled into a messy bun stood as I entered, her eyes, so like my own, filling with tears. "Grandma," Emma whispered, rushing toward me with arms outstretched. I embraced my granddaughter, breathing in the familiar scent of the lavender shampoo she'd used since high school. At 19, Emma was the perfect blend of Wilson features: my eyes and stubborn chin, James's high cheekbones, Rick's dimple when she smiled. But unlike her father, there was nothing guarded in her expression, only genuine emotion. "I came as soon as I could get away," she said, drawing back to look at me. "Dad and Mom think I'm at the library studying for finals. They don't know I'm here." Evelyn hovered at the door, clearly uncomfortable with this clandestine visit. "I'll give you some privacy," she said finally, retreating but leaving the door ajar. Standard procedure for monitoring residents, I would later learn. Once we were as alone as we could be in such a place, Emma clasped my hands in hers. "Grandma, I'm so sorry. I had no idea they were planning this. I only found out yesterday when I came home from campus and you weren't at your house." "They didn't tell you?" I asked, surprised that Rick would keep such a significant decision from his daughter, who had always been close to me. Emma shook her head, anger flashing in her eyes. "No, Dad just said you'd moved somewhere more suitable for your needs." When I asked what that meant, Mom changed the subject. It wasn't until I overheard them arguing last night that I realized what they'd done. She described coming home unexpectedly to find Rick and Valerie in a heated dispute about Martha's things and what to do with them. Valerie wanted to hold an estate sale. Rick was hesitant. Neither seemed to be considering that these things were my possessions, my memories, my life. I confronted them. Emma continued, her voice tight with controlled fury. "Dad tried to justify it, saying you were becoming forgetful and needed more care than they could provide." "But Grandma, that's not true. You're sharper than half my professors." Her indignation warmed my heart, but I was troubled by Rick's characterization. "Forgetful? Did he give examples?" "Nothing specific. Just vague comments about you being confused sometimes." Mom backed him up, saying they were worried about you living alone. Emma leaned closer, lowering her voice. "But I think it's about the house, Grandma. They've been meeting with real estate agents. I saw the papers on Dad's desk." A cold certainty settled in my stomach. Of course it was about the house, my beautiful Victorian on a corner lot in Burlington's most desirable neighborhood, just blocks from Lake Champlain. Property values had skyrocketed in recent years as tech companies moved into the area, bringing wealthy young professionals hungry for historic homes with character. "Emma," I said carefully, "did you happen to see any documents I might have signed? Papers about the house or my finances?" My granddaughter's expression turned thoughtful. Not exactly, but Dad has a home office that's usually locked. Yesterday the door was open and I saw a new file on his desk labeled Wilson Property Transfer. I couldn't look inside before they came back. This confirmation of Grace's suspicions that Rick and Valerie had orchestrated a deliberate transfer of my property rather than a misunderstanding strengthened my resolve, but it also deepened the pain. This wasn't a son making a difficult decision for an ailing mother. This was calculated deception. "Emma, I need your help," I said, explaining about Grace and Thomas Reynolds, the legal avenues we were exploring, and the documentation I was gathering. "If you could find that file or any information about what I signed." "I'll do better than that," Emma replied, determination hardening her features in a way that reminded me powerfully of myself at her age. "I'll get you copies of everything. Dad's not as tech-savvy as he thinks. I know his computer password." We spent the next hour strategizing. Emma would search for the documents when her parents were out, take photos of anything relevant, and bring them to me during her next visit. She'd also check my mail, which was likely being forwarded to Rick's address, for any financial statements or legal notices. "And your house, Grandma," she added, eyes flashing with righteous anger. "I'll make sure they don't sell it or empty it before we can fight this. I still have my key." As our visit drew to a close, Emma reached into her backpack and withdrew something wrapped in tissue paper. "I brought this for you. I thought you might need it." Inside was my favorite photograph of James, the one from our honeymoon in Cape Cod, where he stood laughing on the beach, young and handsome in his rolled-up trousers, the wind tousling his hair. I'd kept it on my bedside table for 45 years. "Thank you," I whispered, tears threatening as I traced the familiar image with my fingertip. "This means more than you know." Emma embraced me fiercely before leaving. "We'll fix this, Grandma. I promise." Watching her walk away, her back straight with purpose, I felt a curious mixture of emotions. Pride in the strong, principled young woman she'd become. Gratitude for her unwavering loyalty. Sadness that she was caught between parents and grandmother. And something else. A growing anger that had been building since Grace opened my eyes to the legal implications of what Rick and Valerie had done. I returned to my room clutching James's photograph, my mind racing with possibilities. For the first time since arriving at Pine Haven, I felt a flicker of optimism. With Emma's help, Grace's guidance, and Thomas Reynolds' legal expertise, perhaps I could reclaim not just my house, but my autonomy. That afternoon, true to Grace's word, Thomas Reynolds arrived at Pine Haven for his weekly consultation. Grace introduced us in her unofficial office, where the retired attorney, a tall man with deep smile lines and salt and pepper hair, listened intently as I recounted my story. "Mrs. Wilson," he said when I finished, "what you're describing is unfortunately common, but that doesn't make it legal or acceptable. If you were coerced or misled into transferring your property, we have grounds to petition for nullification." He explained the legal process ahead, gathering evidence, filing motions, possibly facing Rick and Valerie in court. It wouldn't be quick or easy, he cautioned, but Vermont's elder protection statutes were on my side if we could prove deception. "The key will be establishing that you signed those documents without understanding their true purpose," Thomas explained, making notes in a leather-bound portfolio. "Did anyone witness these signings? Was there a notary present?" I thought back to that day 6 months ago when Rick had arrived with the stack of papers. Our neighbor Walter Jenkins was there, I recalled. Rick asked him to come over as a witness. And yes, there was a notary, a young woman from Rick's bank. Thomas looked up sharply. "Rick's bank? Not your bank?" "No, I've been with Vermont Federal Credit Union for decades. Rick banks with National Trust." Thomas and Grace exchanged meaningful glances. "That's significant," Thomas said. "It suggests premeditation. They brought in a notary who wouldn't recognize you or question why these transfers were happening." By the end of our meeting, we had outlined a strategy. Thomas would file preliminary paperwork to prevent Rick from selling my house while we built our case. Grace would help me request my complete medical records to counter any claims that I was cognitively impaired, and I would continue documenting everything, including my daily activities at Pine Haven, to demonstrate my competence. As Thomas gathered his materials to leave, he paused, his expression softening. "Mrs. Wilson, I want you to know something. In 30 years of practicing elder law, I've seen countless cases like yours. The legal battle ahead will be challenging, but you have something many of my clients lacked, a support network. With Grace's expertise, your granddaughter's assistance, and your own determination, we have a strong chance of success." His words bolstered my spirits as I navigated the next few days at Pine Haven. I began participating in activities, not because I'd accepted my situation, but because each completed crossword puzzle, each coherent contribution to the current events discussion group, each skillfully executed watercolor in art therapy was evidence of my mental acuity. I also started forming relationships with other residents, discovering that behind many of their vacant expressions were stories similar to mine, children who had made decisions for them without consultation, assets mysteriously transferred, promises broken. Some, like Walter Jenkins from the dining hall, had accepted their fate with resignation. Others harbored quiet resentment, but felt powerless to challenge their circumstances. "You're really going to fight this?" asked Mildred, an 80-year-old former librarian whose son had moved her to Pine Haven after selling her farm to developers. We were sitting in the small garden behind the facility, enjoying a rare moment of spring sunshine. "I am," I confirmed, watching a robin tug at a worm in the freshly turned earth of a flower bed. "My house isn't just property. It's my independence, my history, my right to choose how and where I live." Mildred considered this, her gnarled fingers fidgeting with the edges of her sweater. "I wish I'd fought when they first brought me here 3 years ago. Now it feels too late. The farm is gone, turned into luxury condominiums." Her regret strengthened my resolve. I wouldn't look back years from now and wonder what might have been if I'd stood up for myself. Whatever the outcome, I would fight with everything I had. Sunday arrived, the day Rick had promised to visit. I dressed carefully in my nicest outfit, applied lipstick, and arranged my hair. Not for Rick's benefit, but for my own. I wanted him to see a mother in full possession of her faculties, not a doddering old woman who could be easily dismissed. But as visiting hours came and went, Rick didn't appear. I sat in the reception area until a sympathetic aide suggested I return to my room, promising to notify me if he arrived later. He never did. That night I stared at James's photograph on my nightstand, imagining what he would say if he could see our son now, the boy we'd raised with such love, the man who had become capable of such callous betrayal. "What did we miss, James?" I whispered to the smiling image. "Where did we go wrong?" Monday brought an unexpected development. Emma arrived after her morning classes, breathless with excitement and trepidation. "Grandma," she said, closing my door carefully after checking the hallway was empty, "I found something you need to see." From her backpack, she withdrew a manila folder, glancing nervously over her shoulder as she placed it on my bed. "I went to your house yesterday. I told Dad I needed to pick up some books I'd left there. While I was there, I searched his car. He'd left his briefcase in the trunk, and inside was this." The folder was labeled Wilson Estate Planning in Valerie's precise handwriting. Inside were copies of the documents I'd signed, a durable power of attorney, a quitclaim deed transferring my house to Rick, and amendments to my will making him sole beneficiary and executor. But what made my blood run cold were the handwritten notes in the margins, clearly in Valerie's writing. "Tell Martha it's just for banking convenience. Emphasize potential tax benefits to her. Don't mention property transfer explicitly. If she questions, redirect to health concerns." Most disturbing was a checklist titled Senior Transition Plan, with my name at the top, containing steps like secure POA, transfer deed, consolidate accounts, identify facility, and schedule move date. Each item was checked off methodically, with dates noted beside them. This wasn't an impulsive decision or a misunderstanding. It was a calculated plan, executed over months. "There's more," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. She pulled out her phone and showed me photographs she'd taken of Valerie's home office computer screen. Mom's a real estate agent, but she has a side business I never knew about. She calls it Senior Transition Services. From what I can tell, she's done this before, helped families transition elderly relatives to care facilities while taking control of their assets. The evidence was damning. Spreadsheets showing properties acquired, sales prices, commissions earned, emails between Valerie and colleagues discussing easy targets and optimal timing, a PowerPoint presentation titled Securing Family Assets, Legal Strategies for Senior Transitions, that outline methods for transferring property from elderly relatives. I think Dad might not know the full extent of it, Emma added, chewing her lower lip anxiously. In some of their emails, Mom talks about keeping Richard focused on the benefits and managing his concerns. I think she's manipulating him too, Grandma. This revelation landed like a physical blow. Was Rick a perpetrator or another victim of Valerie's schemes? The evidence suggested something in between. A son who perhaps hadn't initiated the plan, but had ultimately chosen to participate, who had driven me to Pine Haven knowing exactly what he was doing, who had looked into my eyes and lied. Does she have other victims? I asked, thumbing through the documents with growing horror. Emma nodded grimly. At least 5 that I could identify from her files. All elderly people with valuable properties, all now in various care facilities around Vermont and New Hampshire. And she works with a network, other real estate agents, a lawyer, even a doctor who provides competency assessments when needed. I sat heavily on the edge of my bed, trying to process the scope of what we'd uncovered. This wasn't just about my house anymore. It was about a systematic operation targeting vulnerable seniors, stripping them of their assets and autonomy under the guise of care. Emma, I said, finding my voice at last, we need to take this to Thomas Reynolds immediately. This isn't just elder abuse, it's organized fraud. My granddaughter squared her shoulders, reminding me so much of myself at her age that my heart swelled with pride despite the circumstances. I've already made copies of everything, she said. And Grandma, I think we should go to the police. As she gathered the documents to return them to Rick's briefcase before he noticed their absence, Emma paused, her expression troubled. What about Dad? He's still my father, but what he's done, what he's part of. I reached for her hand, understanding her conflict all too well. Your father will have to answer for his choices, Emma, but people can change, can find redemption. Right now, our priority has to be stopping this operation and helping those who've been victimized. After Emma left, I sat for a long time by my window, watching spring rain pattern the glass as I contemplated what lay ahead. The legal battle would be more complex than we'd initially thought, the stakes higher, the potential consequences for Rick more severe. Yet alongside my anger and determination grew something unexpected, a sense of purpose larger than my own situation. Grace had found meaning in helping others at Pine Haven after her own ordeal. Perhaps this was my calling too, not just to reclaim my home, but to expose a system that had failed to protect the vulnerable, to give voice to those who had been silenced. That evening, as I prepared for bed, my phone rang, the first call I'd received since arriving at Pine Haven. It was Emma, her voice tight with urgency. Grandma, Dad just discovered the documents are missing. He's tearing the house apart looking for them. I think he suspects me. Are you safe? I asked, immediately concerned. For now, I'm back at my dorm. But Grandma, there's something else. I overheard Mom on the phone before I left. They're planning to sell your house this week. They already have a buyer lined up. We need to move fast. We need to move fast. Emma's words echoed in my mind as I hung up the phone, my heart racing. If Rick and Valerie already had a buyer for my home, time was working against us. I needed to act immediately, but locked away in Pine Haven with limited resources and mobility, what could I do? I glanced at the clock, 9:15 p.m. Too late to call Thomas Reynolds, and Grace would likely be asleep. I paced my small room, James's photograph clutched in my hand like a talisman, fighting the rising panic. My entire life, 40 years of memories, James's belongings, the garden I'd cultivated through countless seasons, all about to be sold to strangers without my consent. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. I opened the door to find Grace, still fully dressed despite the late hour, her expression grave. Emma called me, she said without preamble. May I come in? I stepped aside, relief washing over me at the sight of her calm competence. Grace settled into the room's only armchair, while I perched on the edge of the bed. Thomas is already working on an emergency injunction, she explained. He'll file it first thing tomorrow morning to prevent any sale of your property. But we need to do more than just react legally. We need to be strategic. Grace outlined a multi-pronged approach, while Thomas handled the legal maneuvers. We would gather additional evidence and build public pressure that might force Rick and Valerie to back down. Abusers thrive in secrecy, Grace said, her eyes hard with determination born from experience. Let's shine a light on what they're doing. By midnight, we had formulated a plan that left me both terrified and exhilarated. It would require courage, perfect timing, and the willingness to publicly expose family matters I'd always kept private. But as Grace reminded me, this wasn't just about my house anymore. It was about stopping a predatory scheme that had victimized multiple seniors. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Grace asked as she prepared to leave. "Once we start, there's no going back. Rick and Valerie will fight, and things will get messy." I thought of my classroom at Burlington Elementary, where I taught generations of children about integrity and standing up for what's right. What example would I set now if I retreated from this fight? "I'm ready," I said, straightening my shoulders. "Let's begin." The next morning arrived with a clarity I hadn't felt since before Rick abandoned me at Pinehaven. After breakfast, Grace and I met with Evelyn Sharp in her office, requesting my complete file and formally notifying her that I was contesting my placement at the facility. "I'm being held here against my will," I stated clearly, making sure my words were noted in the record. Grace insisted Evelyn keep of our meeting. "I did not consent to admission. I'm not incapacitated, and I have legal representation." Evelyn's practiced professional demeanor slipped momentarily, revealing uncertainty. This wasn't in her script for handling difficult residents. "Mrs. Wilson, your son assured us." "My son has no legal authority to make decisions for me," I interrupted, the teacher in me emerging as I corrected her assumption. "The documents he presented were obtained through deception. My attorney will be contacting your legal department this afternoon." We left Evelyn flustered and defensive, exactly as Grace had predicted. "Now she'll contact Rick," Grace murmured as we walked away, "and he'll know we're not going quietly." By noon, Thomas Reynolds had filed for an emergency injunction to prevent the sale of my house. By 2 o'clock, Emma had delivered copies of Valerie's incriminating documents to Thomas's office. And by 4 o'clock, we received word that a judge had granted the temporary injunction. My house couldn't be sold until a hearing determined the validity of the property transfer. Our first victory was bittersweet. The house was protected for now, but we were just beginning what promised to be a difficult battle. As if to underscore this reality, my phone rang late that afternoon. It was Rick. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded without greeting, his voice tight with anger I'd rarely heard from him. I took a deep breath, centering myself. "Fighting for what's mine, Richard." "What do you think you're doing?" "We're trying to protect you. You're not capable of managing that big house anymore. You've been forgetting things, leaving burners on, missing appointments." "Lies," I said quietly, cutting through his manufactured concerns. "You and I both know I'm perfectly competent. This isn't about my well-being. It's about Valerie's senior transition services and the money you stand to make from selling my home." Silence stretched across the line, so complete I could hear Rick's breathing change pattern as he realized the extent of what I knew. "Mom," he finally said, his voice shifting to a placating tone that made my skin crawl. "You don't understand. Valerie's business helps families make difficult decisions. Yes, we're selling the house, but only because it makes financial sense for everyone. The proceeds will ensure you have the best care possible for the rest of your life." "Spare me the sales pitch," I replied, surprised by my own calm in the face of such brazen lies. "I've seen the documents, Rick, the notes in the margins, the checklist for my transition. I know about the other victims. Did you think Emma wouldn't figure it out?" Another long silence. When Rick spoke again, his voice had hardened. "You've always underestimated me, Mom. Always treated me like I couldn't make my own decisions. Well, I've made this one. The house is legally mine now, and one judge's temporary order won't change that. You're an old woman who belongs in a care facility. No one will believe you over us." His cruelty stole my breath momentarily. This wasn't my son speaking, or was it? Had this capacity for callousness always existed beneath the surface, waiting for the right catalyst? "You're wrong about who people will believe," I said finally. "We'll see each other in court, Richard." I hung up before he could respond, my hands trembling not with fear, but with a cold, clarifying anger. Whatever doubts I'd harbored about pursuing legal action against my own son evaporated with that conversation. The man on the phone wasn't someone I recognized, or perhaps more frighteningly, he was showing me who he truly was for the first time. Grace found me staring out my window an hour later, still processing Rick's words. "Bad call?" she asked, noting my expression. "Illuminating," I replied, turning from the view of Pine Haven's manicured but soulless grounds. "He's not backing down, and I'm not sure he's being manipulated by Valerie anymore. He sounded committed to this course." Grace nodded, unsurprised. "People reveal themselves in conflict, but remember, Martha, this isn't just about Rick now. This is about stopping a systematic exploitation of vulnerable seniors." She was right, of course, and the next phase of our plan would drive that point home. The following morning, a reporter from the Burlington Free Press arrived at Pine Haven, requesting an interview with me about elder financial abuse and forced facility placement. Grace had arranged it through contacts from her civil rights days, ensuring the reporter, Caroline Winters, a veteran journalist known for her exposés on corruption, understood the broader implications of my story. Evelyn tried to prevent the interview, citing resident privacy policies, but Caroline coolly informed her that freedom of the press didn't end at Pine Haven's doors, and that preventing a resident from speaking to media could constitute unlawful detention. Faced with this unexpected resistance, Evelyn retreated, allowing us to use the facility's garden for our conversation. For 2 hours, I shared my story with Caroline: the deceptive property transfer, the abandonment at Pine Haven, the discovery of Valerie's systematic exploitation of other seniors. I showed her copies of the documents Emma had found, including the damning checklist and margin notes. Most importantly, I connected her with 2 other victims Grace had identified through her network of elder rights advocates. "This isn't an isolated family dispute," I emphasized as our interview concluded. "It's a pattern of predatory behavior, targeting one of society's most vulnerable populations. How many elderly people are sitting in facilities like this right now? Their homes sold, their assets liquidated, their autonomy stolen, all under the guise of care." Caroline's article appeared 3 days later, front page of the Sunday edition. Elder exploitation scheme. Uncovered, prominent real estate agent accused of systematic fraud against seniors. The piece detailed Valerie's operation, included statements from multiple victims, and quoted experts on elder law who confirmed the predatory nature of such transition services. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. By Monday morning, the story had been picked up by regional news outlets. By Tuesday, it had gone national, with major networks sending reporters to Burlington. The state attorney general's office announced an investigation into Valerie's business practices and those of her associates. The Vermont Real Estate Commission suspended her license pending review. And most significantly for me personally, other victims began coming forward, not just of Valerie's scheme, but of similar operations across the country. My phone at Pine Haven rang constantly with calls from reporters, attorneys, and advocates. Grace helped me navigate this sudden attention, ensuring I stayed focused on our ultimate goals: reclaiming my home, securing my independence, and bringing those responsible to justice. Through it all, I waited for some response from Rick. Would he distance himself from Valerie's scheme, claim ignorance, reach out to make amends? But days passed with no word until Thursday morning, when Thomas Reynolds arrived at Pine Haven with news that made my heart sink despite our public relations victories. "Rick and Valerie have filed a counter-petition," Thomas explained as we gathered in Grace's unofficial office. "They're seeking formal guardianship over you, Martha, claiming you're experiencing cognitive decline and are being manipulated by outside interests, meaning us. The irony would have been laughable if it weren't so threatening. They were now claiming I was the one being manipulated, not them doing the manipulating. Can they succeed?" I asked, anxiety tightening my chest. "It's a desperate move," Thomas assured me, "but not without strategic value. It complicates our case and shifts focus from the property transfer to to your competency. They've submitted affidavits from a Dr. Lawrence Phillips claiming he's observed significant cognitive impairment during your annual physicals. That's absurd, I exclaimed. Dr. Phillips has seen me for 15 minutes once a year for routine checkups. He's never conducted any cognitive assessments. Grace's expression darkened. Lawrence Phillips? He's on the list of professionals Emma found in Valerie's network. He provides convenient diagnoses when needed to facilitate these transitions. Thomas nodded grimly. Exactly. But the court doesn't know that yet. We'll need to counter with an independent evaluation from a respected geriatric specialist. Thus began the most humiliating phase of our fight, proving my own competence through a series of assessments and evaluations. Dr. Eleanor Ramirez, a renowned geriatric neurologist recommended by Thomas, conducted a comprehensive cognitive assessment at Pine Haven the following week. For 4 hours, I completed memory tests, problem-solving exercises, spatial reasoning challenges, and verbal fluency evaluations. I drew clock faces, repeated number sequences backward, recalled details from stories read to me 30 minutes earlier, and explained abstract concepts like a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. Throughout the testing, I fought anxiety that threatened to undermine my performance. What if I made normal age-related errors that could be twisted to support Rick's claims? What if, despite my certainty in my capabilities, some objective measure revealed impairments I wasn't aware of? But as Dr. Ramirez packed up her materials, her warm smile reassured me. Mrs. Wilson, while I can't discuss specific results until my formal report is complete, I want you to know that you have nothing to worry about. Your cognitive functioning is exemplary for someone of any age, let alone a woman in her 70s. Her official report, delivered to Thomas a week later, was unequivocal. I displayed superior cognitive function across all domains assessed, with no indication of impairment that would affect decision-making capacity or independent living skills. Armed with this evidence, Thomas filed a motion to dismiss Rick and Valerie's guardianship petition and accelerate the hearing on the property transfer. The court date was set for June 12th, still 3 weeks away, but closer than we dared hope. As the legal machinery ground forward, Emma continued her clandestine intelligence gathering. Despite the public exposure of Valerie's scheme, Rick and Valerie remained in my house, apparently determined to weather the storm of negative publicity. Emma reported that they'd hired a high-powered defense attorney specializing in real estate law and had been shredding documents at an alarming rate. They're destroying evidence, she told me during one of her regular visits to Pine Haven. But they don't know I already copied the most incriminating files, and they don't know about the recordings. Recordings? I asked, surprised. Emma nodded, a hint of mischief in her expression despite the serious circumstances. Remember the smart speaker you got me for Christmas last year? I set up a similar one in their home office before everything blew up. It's been capturing their conversations for weeks. I was momentarily taken aback by this revelation. My granddaughter had outmaneuvered her parents with technology they barely understood, creating a record of conversations they thought private. The ethics were questionable. But given what was at stake, is that legal? I asked hesitantly. Thomas says it's a gray area, Emma admitted. Vermont is a one-party consent state for recordings, but this pushes the boundaries. He thinks the recordings might not be admissible in court, but they're invaluable for our strategy. We know exactly what they're planning because they're discussing it in what they think is a secure space. And what they were planning, according to Emma's intelligence, was to double down rather than retreat. They would claim I had been showing signs of dementia for months, but had hidden it well. They would paint Grace as an opportunistic influence, taking advantage of a vulnerable senior. They would characterize the media coverage as sensationalized reporting, driven by a slow news cycle. Most disturbing of all, they were considering selling my house despite the injunction, using a straw buyer who would later transfer the property back to them once the legal issues were resolved. The scheme was legally dubious, but it revealed their desperation and their continued willingness to circumvent the law. This information allowed us to prepare counter strategies for each of their moves. When their attorney filed motions, Thomas was ready with responses. When they attempted to limit my access to visitors at Pine Haven, claiming it was for my protection, Grace had already arranged for a civil liberties attorney to challenge the restriction. When they tried to freeze my bank accounts, claiming I was being financially exploited, Emma had already helped me transfer my funds to a new account they couldn't access. It was exhausting, this constant chess match of legal maneuvers. But with each small victory, my confidence grew. I was no longer the shell-shocked woman who had been abandoned at Pine Haven's door. I was fighting back, reclaiming not just my property, but my power. As the court date approached, an unexpected opportunity arose. The state senator who chaired Vermont's Committee on Aging and Independent Living had been following the media coverage of our case. Concerned about the broader implications for elder rights, she invited me to testify at a special hearing on financial exploitation and coerced placement of seniors. Grace urged me to accept. This isn't just about your case anymore, Martha. It's about changing the system that allowed this to happen to you and so many others. And so, 2 weeks before my court date, I found myself seated before a panel of legislators in Montpelier, telling my story not as a private family matter, but as a matter of public policy. I spoke of the deception, the isolation, the profound violation of having my autonomy stripped away. What happened to me could happen to any of you, I told the somber-faced senators, or your parents, or grandparents. Our current laws have loopholes large enough to drive a moving van through, the same van that might show up to empty your house while you're taken to a facility against your will. My testimony, alongside that of other victims and experts, made headlines across New England. The committee promised immediate action, drafting emergency legislation to strengthen protections against undue influence in property transfers involving seniors and creating stricter oversight of transitional care placements. As I returned to Pine Haven that evening, exhausted but fulfilled, I received a text message from an unknown number. It read simply, "Mom, we need to talk. This has gone too far." Rick, I stared at the text message, emotions colliding like storm fronts inside me. After weeks of legal battles, media exposure, and the systematic dismantling of his claims about my competence, Rick wanted to talk, not through lawyers or court filings, but directly, mother to son. I showed the message to Grace, who frowned thoughtfully. "It could be a trap," she cautioned. "They might be trying to get you to say something they can use against you." Her concerns were valid, but something in the terseness of Rick's message suggested genuine desperation rather than calculation. After discussing it with Thomas, we agreed I would meet Rick, but not alone, and not without precautions. The meeting was arranged for the following afternoon in a neutral location, a small conference room at Thomas Reynolds' law office. Emma insisted on being present, despite the awkwardness of facing her father across the table. Grace would attend as my support person, and Thomas would be there to ensure no legal landmines were triggered. I barely slept that night, rehearsing what I might say to my son after everything that had transpired. What does a mother say to a child who betrayed her so completely? What words could possibly bridge the chasm that had opened between us? When we arrived at Thomas's office the next day, Rick was already there, sitting alone at the conference table. No Valerie, no lawyer, just my son, looking more haggard than I'd ever seen him. His normally immaculate appearance had deteriorated. Wrinkled shirt, tie loosened, dark circles under his eyes. He stood awkwardly when I entered, his gaze flicking between me and Emma before settling somewhere on the table between us. "Mom," he said, his voice hoarse, "thank you for coming." I took a seat across from him, Grace and Emma flanking me like sentinels. Thomas positioned at the head of the table with a legal pad in front of him. "I'm listening, Rick," I said simply. He cleared his throat, fingers fidgeting with a pen. I need to explain some things, not to justify what happened, but so you understand." For the next 30 minutes, Rick unspooled a narrative that, while not exonerating him, cast the situation in a different light. He explained how his relationship with Valerie had evolved over the years, from equal partnership to something more manipulative, how financial pressures from her spending habits and their lifestyle had mounted, how her senior transition services had begun as legitimate assistance for families, but gradually crossed ethical and legal lines. I knew about the business, he admitted, not meeting my eyes. But I didn't know the extent of it until recently. I didn't know there were other victims. You knew enough to drive me to Pine Haven under false pretenses, I countered, keeping my voice steady despite the anger bubbling beneath the surface. You knew enough to lie about documents you had me sign. Rick nodded, shoulders slumping. Yes, I did that. I can't undo it. But Mom, you have to believe me. I never thought of it as exploitation. Valerie convinced me it was for your own good, that you were showing early signs of cognitive decline, that the house was too much for you to manage. Those were lies, Rick. I've never been diagnosed with any cognitive issues, and my recent evaluation confirms I'm perfectly competent. I know that now, he said, looking directly at me for the first time. The evaluation results were eye-opening, and when Emma confronted me about the documents she found, he glanced at his daughter, whose expression remained determinedly neutral. Everything started unraveling. Valerie and I have been fighting constantly. She blames me for not containing the situation, for letting it become public. Emma leaned forward, unable to maintain her silence. Dad, you were recorded discussing plans to sell Grandma's house despite the court injunction. You were active in this, not just some passive bystander. Rick flinched as if struck. You recorded us? I did what I had to do to protect Grandma, Emma replied, unflinching. Someone in this family had to. The rebuke landed visibly on Rick, who seemed to shrink further into himself. You're right, he said quietly. I was active in it. I convinced myself it was justified because I needed to believe that. The truth is, he paused, struggling with words that clearly pained him. The truth is, we needed the money. Valerie's spending, the mortgage on our house, Emma's college tuition. We're underwater financially. Your house, Mom, free and clear of any debt, represented a solution to problems I was too ashamed to admit even to myself. The confession hung in the air, pitiful in its honesty. My son had been willing to steal my home, my independence, my dignity, not out of concern for my well-being, but to solve his own financial problems. Why are you telling us this now? Thomas asked, breaking his observant silence. Your case against Mrs. Wilson is scheduled for court next week. This admission undermines your entire position. Rick ran a hand through his disheveled hair. Because I can't do it anymore. I can't keep lying in affidavits, making up stories about my mother's mental state, watching this destroy our family. He turned to me, eyes brimming with unshed tears. And because Valerie has left me. She took what money we had left and disappeared 3 days ago. The FBI came to the house yesterday. Apparently her business extended across state lines, which makes it federal wire fraud. The revelations stunned us all into momentary silence. Valerie, the architect of this scheme, had abandoned ship, and Rick, when it became clear the legal consequences were inevitable. So you're here because Valerie left you, not because you've had a genuine change of heart, Grace observed, her tone neutral but pointed. Rick's expression crumpled. That's not fair, Isn't it? I interrupted, finding my voice. You came here after your wife abandoned you, after the FBI showed up, after all your options disappeared. Not when you first realized what you were doing was wrong. Not when Emma confronted you with evidence. Not when my cognitive assessment proved I was competent. You're here now because you have nowhere else to turn. My words were harsh, but necessary. If there was to be any healing between us, it couldn't be built on convenient half-truths. You're right, Rick admitted after a long moment. I should have come forward sooner. I should have stopped this before it went so far. I didn't know how to back out once we started. It felt like there was no turning back. There's always a way back to doing the right thing, I said, softening slightly at the genuine remorse in his expression. The question is whether you're willing to do what's necessary now to make amends. Thomas leaned forward, ever the practical attorney. Mrs. Wilson raises an important point. If you're sincere about making this right, Mr. Wilson, there are concrete steps you can take. Withdrawing your guardianship petition, signing documents returning the property to your mother, providing a full statement to authorities about Valerie's operation and your involvement in it. Rick nodded slowly. I'll do all of that. I've already spoken with the FBI, told them everything I know about Valerie's network. I'm prepared to face whatever legal consequences come my way. He looked at me, then at Emma. I know it doesn't erase what I did, but I want to try to make it right. Emma, who had maintained remarkable composure throughout the meeting, finally broke. How could you do this, Dad? How could you treat Grandma this way after everything she's done for you, for us? The raw pain in her voice seemed to wound Rick more deeply than any legal threat. I have no excuse, Emma, he said, voice breaking. I failed as a son. I failed as a father. I let greed and fear override everything I was taught about doing what's right. He turned to me. Mom, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I'm not asking for that. I'm just asking for a chance to try to make amends however I can. I studied my son's face, the boy I'd raised, the man who had betrayed me, and now this broken figure before me seeking, what? Redemption? Absolution? Understanding? Whatever he sought, I wasn't ready to give it freely. Trust, once shattered, doesn't mend with a single conversation. I need time, Rick, I said finally. What you've done isn't something I can simply forgive over one meeting, but I acknowledge your willingness to make things right legally. That's a start. The meeting concluded with Thomas outlining next steps. Rick would meet with his paralegal immediately to sign documents transferring the house back to me. He would withdraw all legal actions against me. He would provide a sworn statement about the circumstances of my placement at Pine Haven. As Rick prepared to leave, he paused at the door. Mom, where will you go when this is over? Back to the house? It was a question I'd been pondering myself in recent weeks. My fight to reclaim my home had been about principle as much as the property itself, about asserting my right to self-determination. But during my time at Pine Haven, working with Grace and meeting other residents who had experienced similar exploitation, I discovered a purpose I hadn't anticipated. I haven't decided yet, I answered truthfully. The house is mine to choose what to do with. That's what matters. Rick nodded, understanding the implicit rebuke in my response. As he left, Emma hesitated, then followed him into the hallway. Through the partially open door, I could hear fragments of their conversation, her anger, his apologies, mutual tears. Their relationship would require its own healing journey, separate from mine with Rick. The legal proceedings moved swiftly after Rick's capitulation. Within days, the property was legally mine again. The guardianship petition was withdrawn. The emergency injunction became unnecessary when there was no longer a dispute over ownership. Thomas handled everything with characteristic efficiency, shielding me from the procedural details while keeping me informed of the outcomes. What I hadn't anticipated was the broader impact of our case. The media coverage of Valerie's senior transition services scheme had sparked investigations across 3 states. The Vermont legislature expedited the Elder Protection Bill I testified for, naming it the Wilson Act, in recognition of how my case had exposed systemic vulnerabilities. Most significantly, a national conversation had begun about the rights of elderly Americans and the insidious nature of financial exploitation disguised as care. 2 weeks after my meeting with Rick, I stood once again on the porch of my Victorian home on Maple Street. Emma had helped clean the house and restore it to the condition it had been in before Rick and Valerie's occupation. My furniture was back in its proper places, my books returned to their shelves, my garden tended in my absence by neighbor Walter Jenkins, who had been among the first to call when news of my situation broke. As I turned the key in the lock and stepped inside, I was struck by conflicting emotions. Relief at reclaiming my space, sadness for the family bonds damaged perhaps beyond repair, pride in the fight I'd waged and won, and unexpectedly a sense that this house, while precious to me, was no longer the only place I could envision myself. The following day, I invited Grace to tea in my garden. As we sat among the blooming roses and clematis, teacups balanced on saucers just as we'd done in her unofficial office at Pine Haven, I shared the idea that had been forming in my mind. I'm thinking of using part of the house as a resource center, I explained, for elderly people facing exploitation or coerced placement, a place where they can get legal advice, support, advocacy, everything we had to piece together ourselves. Grace's eyes lit up with understanding, like what I'd been doing informally at Pine Haven, but with proper resources and visibility. Exactly. We could call it the New Beginnings Elder Rights Center. Thomas has already offered to provide pro bono legal consultations. Emma wants to develop a technology program to help seniors protect their digital assets. And I'd live in the upstairs apartment, maintaining my independence while making the main floor available for this work. Martha Wilson, Grace said with a smile, you never cease to amaze me. Most people who've been through what you have would just want to put it behind them. You're looking for ways to help others avoid the same fate. I sipped my tea, considering her words. Maybe it's the teacher in me, or maybe it's just that at 72, I've realized that purpose is as important as peace. This experience, as painful as it was, showed me that I still have something to contribute. A week later, I received an unexpected visit from Rick. He stood awkwardly on my porch, not presuming to enter without invitation, a manila envelope in his hands. These are the last of your financial documents, he said when I opened the door, and some photos I found that I thought you might want back. I invited him in, but only as far as the foyer. We weren't ready for more than that. Perhaps we never would be. As he handed me the envelope, I noticed a fading bruise on his wrist. What happened there? I asked, nodding toward the injury. Rick glanced down, embarrassed. Community service. I'm helping renovate a senior center in the North End. Turns out I'm not very good with hammers. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. As part of his plea agreement with prosecutors, Rick had avoided jail time, but was required to complete 500 hours of community service in facilities serving elderly populations. It was a fitting consequence, one that might, with time and genuine effort, lead to understanding what he had failed to comprehend before. The FBI located Valerie in Arizona, he offered after an awkward silence. She's being extradited back to Vermont to face charges. They found evidence of at least 12 other cases besides yours. I nodded, processing this information without the satisfaction I might once have expected to feel. Valerie's eventual conviction wouldn't erase what had happened, wouldn't heal the wounds inflicted. Justice, I was learning, often feels incomplete, even when served. I'm turning the house into an elder rights center, I told him, watching his reaction carefully. Surprise flickered across his face, followed by something that looked like respect. That's good, Mom. Really good. Emma's helping with the planning. She has quite a talent for organization. She gets that from you, Rick said softly. She always has. Another silence stretched between us, filled with all the things we couldn't yet say to each other. The betrayal was too recent, the trust too thoroughly broken for easy reconciliation. But as Rick turned to leave, I found myself saying something I hadn't planned. Sunday dinners are at 5. If you want to come sometime, call first. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was an acknowledgement that the door wasn't permanently closed, that with time, with consistent effort to make amends, with genuine change, there might be a path forward for us as family, however redefined. As summer bloomed in Burlington, the New Beginnings Elder Rights Center began taking shape. The living room became a consultation space. The dining room transformed into a resource library. The sun porch served as a welcoming area where seniors could drop in for information or support. Emma installed simple technology that would allow people to securely document their wishes and financial arrangements, creating records that could prevent the kind of exploitation I had experienced. And upstairs, in my private apartment, I maintained the independent life I had fought so hard to preserve, teaching a literature class at the community college, tending my garden, having tea with Grace, and slowly, cautiously, rebuilding connections with Rick through carefully bounded interactions. The Wilson Act passed the Vermont legislature unanimously and was signed into law in August, requiring independent verification of property transfers involving seniors and establishing a review process for non-emergency facility placements. Other states began considering similar legislation, with several inviting me to testify about my experience. My story had become something larger than myself, a catalyst for change, a warning, and ultimately a source of hope for others facing similar situations. The betrayal that began with those 9 devastating words, "Pack your bags, I'm taking you where you deserve," had led to an outcome I could never have imagined that day at Pine Haven's entrance. Not everything was resolved, of course. The damage to family relationships would take years to heal, if it ever fully did. The legal ramifications for Valerie and her associates were still unfolding, and I carried emotional scars from the experience that would occasionally make themselves known in moments of vulnerability or distrust. But as I watched the first client leave the New Beginning Center with resources, support, and renewed confidence in her rights, I understood something profound. We don't always get to choose what happens to us, but we can choose what we do with what happens. We can allow betrayal to diminish us, or we can transform it into purpose. We can retreat from pain, or we can use it to fuel change. I had chosen the latter path, and in doing so, I discovered that even at 72, life could offer new beginnings, unexpected ones born from difficulty, but no less valuable for their complicated origins. Today, as I sit by the bay window of the New Beginnings Elder Rights Center, watching autumn leaves dance across my garden, I find myself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that began with 9 devastating words. Pack your bags, I'm taking you where you deserve. Words that once cut like knives now serve as a reminder of how quickly life can change and how we can transform our deepest wounds into powerful purpose. It's been 6 months since I reclaimed my Victorian home on Maple Street. 6 months of rebuilding, restructuring, and reimagining what my life could be at 72. The center has already assisted 37 seniors facing situations similar to mine. Exploitation disguised as care, property transfers conducted under duress, family members making decisions without proper authority. Each person who walks through our doors carries their own version of betrayal, their own broken trust, their own fear of losing everything they've worked for. I remember clearly the first client we helped, Margaret Jenkins, a 78-year-old retired nurse whose daughter had convinced her to sign over her farm for tax purposes. Margaret came to us after seeing a news segment about my case. Clutching a manila envelope of documents she didn't fully understand, but knew somehow weren't right. With Thomas Reynolds' legal guidance and Emma's technological assistance, we helped Margaret nullify the fraudulent transfer and secure her property with proper protections. The look on her face when she realized she wouldn't lose her home, that mix of relief, vindication, and renewed strength, reminded me powerfully of how I felt standing on my own porch again after weeks at Pinehaven. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that this work was what I was meant to do with my remaining years. The Wilson Act, which passed in Vermont and has now been introduced in 7 other states, stands as perhaps the most far-reaching consequence of my ordeal. The legislation requires independent verification of property transfers involving seniors, establishes a review process for non-emergency facility placements, and creates a specialized unit within the state's Attorney General office focused on elder fraud. Lawmakers tell me it's already prevented dozens of cases like mine. As for Valerie, her trial is scheduled for next month. The FBI's investigation revealed her network extended across 3 states, victimizing at least 28 seniors through her transition services. Several of her associates, including Dr. Lawrence Phillips, who provided fraudulent competency assessments, have already pleaded guilty to reduced charges in exchange for testimony. The Real Estate Commission permanently revoked her license, and civil lawsuits from multiple victims ensure she'll never profit from her schemes. Rick's journey has been more complicated. He completed his 500 hours of community service at senior centers across Burlington, an experience he describes as transformative. Our relationship remains tentative. Sunday dinners sometimes strained, sometimes warming with cautious conversation. Trust rebuilds slowly, if at all, after such profound betrayal. But I've seen genuine change in him, a humility, a thoughtfulness that was absent before. Whether it's enough to truly repair what was broken between us remains an open question. Emma has become my partner in this work, balancing her college studies with developing educational programs for the center. Her generation's technological fluency, combined with a deep commitment to justice, makes her an invaluable advocate for vulnerable seniors. I see in her the future of this movement, younger generations standing alongside their elders to ensure dignity and autonomy aren't sacrificed to convenience or greed. Grace Hernandez remains my dearest friend and advisor. Though she still resides at Pine Haven by choice, she visits the center weekly to provide guidance drawn from her years as a civil rights attorney. "We're changing the narrative," she told me recently, "from elderly dependence to elder empowerment." I couldn't have articulated our mission more perfectly. What began as my personal fight for justice has evolved into something much larger, a movement challenging how society views and treats its aging members. The betrayal that once threatened to define my later years has instead become the catalyst for my most meaningful work. There's a certain poetic justice in that transformation, a reminder that even our darkest moments can lead to unexpected light. If you're watching this and facing your own struggle with family exploitation, facility placement, or any form of elder abuse, please know that you're not alone. Resources exist, laws protect you, and people are ready to help. The shame belongs to those who exploit, not to those who are exploited. Your voice matters, your rights matter, your dignity matters. This channel, Revenge Expected, isn't about vengeance in the traditional sense. It's about reclaiming power from those who would take it. It's about transforming pain into purpose. It's about ensuring that when someone says, "I'm taking you where you deserve," what you truly deserve is respect, autonomy, and justice. I invite you to subscribe to Revenge Expected if you haven't already. Each week, we share stories like mine, stories of betrayal transformed into breakthrough, of pain channeled into positive change. These aren't just cautionary tales. They're roadmaps for resilience, guides for those navigating similar challenges. By subscribing, you join a community of people committed to protecting the vulnerable and challenging systems that enable exploitation. Please take a moment to like this video as well. It helps our message reach more people who might benefit from these stories or who might recognize warning signs in their own family situations. Your simple click extends our reach and amplifies voices that might otherwise go unheard. I especially encourage you to comment below. Share your thoughts, your experiences, your questions. Have you witnessed something similar in your family or community? Are you concerned about an elderly loved one? Are you a senior worried about your own vulnerability? The conversation that happens in the comments often provides support and insights as valuable as the videos themselves. Creating these videos requires considerable effort, research, editing, production, and the courage of those who share their often painful stories. If you found value in what we do, please consider supporting the channel through Super Thanks. This form of financial contribution helps cover our costs and allows us to produce daily content reaching those who need it most. Your support, at whatever level feels comfortable, ensures we can continue bringing these important stories to light. Every Super Thanks contribution directly funds our ability to travel to interview subjects, provide resources to those sharing their stories, and maintain the quality and frequency of our content. It's an investment not just in a YouTube channel, but in a movement to protect vulnerable seniors nationwide. When I look back at that Thursday morning when Rick arrived to take me to Pine Haven, I see now that it wasn't an ending but a beginning. What was intended as abandonment became activation. What was meant to silence me instead gave me a voice that carries further than I could have imagined. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for caring about this issue that affects so many, yet receives too little attention. Thank you for being part of this journey toward justice and dignity for all aging Americans. Until next time on Revenge Expected, remember, our greatest power often emerges from our moments of greatest vulnerability.